There are dozens of us who have spent the past 15 years preparing for this very moment. I'm one of those dozens of people trying to cash in on the years of intel and knowledge on this genre, the scene, and this movement that has been soaked into my brain over the course of my lifetime. And thankfully, this moment has finally come with the summer that is about to hit us in 2021. You can call it a pop punk summer if there ever was one, because the pop punk resurgence that has been brewing for the past couple of years is in full swing at this point. And let me say, the Punk Rock MBA has a great video where he actually talks about the reasons why this is happening. I'm focused on discussing what this revival looks like, what it feels like to be a fan in pop punk in 2021. Now, pop punk has a history that I'd really love to dig into and probably will at some other point in the future. But right now, I want to jump to the part of the story that is most important to the revival what we are seeing right now. Bands like Green Day, Offspring, and Rancid dominated what we called pop punk in the 90s. They turned their deep roots in the punk scene into a pretty accessible sound that felt aligned with what the rest of alternative rock was doing at the time. Blink-182 took this wave one step further, dropping Enema of the State in 1999. The record is the one with classics like What's My Age Again and All the Small Things. The band balanced pop and punk in a way that the early 90s bands just wouldn't really have thought to do, and ended up being pretty successful as the record went triple platinum in the United States within 6 months and has sold over 15 million copies worldwide. And the major labels very quickly used Enema of the State as motivation to latch onto pop punk, and with a lot of vengeance on top of that. They built out a middle class of the scene that drove massive momentum around the music, just like Foster the People did with that indie music stuff in the early 2010s. I think that was a pretty good plug, quite frankly, so watch that video if you haven't. It was this pop punk boom that gave us the likes of Blink-182, but we also got Sum 41, Avril Lavigne, New Found Glory, Yellow Card, The Starting Line, Good Charlotte, and so many more bands who run the gamut of relevance, both at the time and now. Pop punk peaked in the early 2000s, but over the course of the decade, the genre's popularity transitioned into a wave of an emo revival that really took shape of the mainstream in the mid part of the decade. It was this wave of mall emo that was indebted more to moodier 90s bands like the Get Up Kids, Sunny Day Real Estate, and Promise Ring. Bands who overlapped with pop punk enough to appeal to those fans, but were really a more unique movement altogether. And that 2000s mall emo boom became its own animal compared to the early 2000s pop punk boom that preceded it. And this emo wave created bands like Taking Back Sunday, who eventually became Fall Out Boy, Paramore, My Chemical Romance, Panic at the Disco. Now, pop music is built on fads that come and go with time, but one of the most unique things about pop punk and emo that I think make it special compared to the rest of these fads is that those bands and that sound have managed to maintain a really strong influence in the modern history of pop music. You see, a sound like disco was really popular in the 70s, but wasn't extremely relevant to the sound of the 80s. While hair metal may have been relevant in the 80s, it wasn't at all a factor in the rock sound of the 90s. However, pop punk really held its own over the course of the entire 2000s and still managed to carry clout in the 2010s. You had a continuing wave of pop punk bands who became popular in the 2010s. Bands like The Wonder Years, Real Friends, The Story So Far, and other bands in that vein weren't as popular as their 2000s counterparts, but they bridged older fans of that sound with younger fans like myself, many of whom found ways to love the old stuff on top of the new stuff that was forming out of it. The bands and artists making their way in the pop punk scene in the 2020s are going all out, trying to shoot for that popular mainstream attention that the 2010s underground bands didn't really strive for. They're swinging for the fences in all the right ways, and it is bringing out the best in what the sound has to offer and bringing those nostalgic impulses along with them. I think the leaders of this movement are the crossover acts who created bridges for pop punk to meet pop music. The most prominent and perhaps the most important of these crossover acts are acts who are moving between hip hop and pop punk. I say this because the emo rap wave of the 2010s saw rappers carving out a lane by calling to pop punk and emo acts who had dominated a decade earlier. The likes of Lil Peep and Juice WRLD are muses of this scene, excelling as rappers during their lifetime, but also as ambassadors of this sound that some have mistaken to believe was irrelevant in the 2010s. Trippie Redd may have earned his chops in the rap scene, but his latest deluxe edition, Neon Shark vs. Pegasus, saw him work with Travis Barker to release a straight-up pop-punk record, with guests like Machine Gun Kelly and Chino Moreno from Deftones. Iann Dior seemed to come out of nowhere as a superstar, repping that emo rap sound, but his decidedly pop stylings feel incredibly rooted in the melodies and instrumentation of pop-punk. The song he did with 24kGoldn, Mood, is pretty much a pop-punk song with guitars and a little bit of a hip-hop trap beat. And he's also worked with Travis Barker, who has continued to guide him deeper in that direction while maintaining that nominally pop influence. I think that his work really captures a dynamic swath of what this new wave of pop-punk represents at a creative level. I think Blackbear technically applies as a member of this crew. I never thought of him as like a super in-depth hip-hop artist. He was always had an appeal that was rooted in pop-punk and emo, but he's translated that mix and his unique style into becoming a bit of an ambassador across this emerging renaissance that's going on. I mean, it seems like having Blackbear on a track is like a massive stamp of approval in both hip-hop and pop-punk circles, and it's a stamp that mirrors the larger synergy that's taking place between these two scenes. And now, of course, I cannot talk about hip-hop pop-punk crossovers without Machine Gun Kelly. His record, Tickets to My Downfall, is as big of a pop-punk swing as we've seen over the course of the past 5 to 10 years. He's swinging for the fences to reach a commercial audience that most pop-punk bands haven't really aspired for, at least in the later parts of my lifetime so far. We haven't seen this swinging since the genre's commercial peak, and he's ended up creating one of the most successful rock records of the past couple of years. He may have had a built-in advantage to excel given his previous popularity as a rapper, but MGK is emerging and proving his chops as a real icon of this new pop-punk wave. Now, in case it wasn't already clear, Travis Barker has been a bit of a ringleader in this new movement, and he has also worked to build up the all-important middle class of pop-punk acts alongside these crossover acts who are helping to drive the sound popularity forward. Folks like Jxdn and Kennyhoolpa have thrived under Barker's tutelage. Jxdn has come up through TikTok, Kennyhoolpa has come up through more traditional alternative rock promotional channels, but the success of both of them under Barker's watch has shown that there are a lot of paths to become a viable, successful pop-punk musician when the sound is in such high demand. Someone like Youngblood has been making his waves through the scene for years, but his work with Machine Gun Kelly and Travis Barker has wrapped him up under this middle class of newcomers and has offered him a level of credibility that he didn't have previously. I would also put Mod Sun in this territory. He was someone who was putting out music before this revival took place and has a history in the pop-punk and emo sphere, but he went all in on the genre at the right time and has also built up a certain level of celebrity to go alongside it, much in the vein of someone like Machine Gun Kelly. Some of the old players in the pop-punk and emo sphere have also managed to see success during this wave as well. The most notable of this wave is probably All Time Low, a band who was already in the Pop Punk Hall of Fame and was one of the last bands from that early 2000s wave to really take off, but it seems like 2020 and 2021 have been the band's most successful years. Monsters and Once in a Lifetime have showed off the band's ability to write chart toppers, something that was always clear on their records, but the alternative rock sphere was never fully interested in. Now, at this point, they have 2 top 10 alternative rock hits that are going to be on the radio for years to come. A Day to Remember is another interesting band. They were probably one of the most successful pop-punk bands of the 2010s, if not the most commercially successful, and they've continued to excel. They dropped You're Welcome early this year, and while I'm not here to say whether that record is actually good, the fact that the band is still successful and is still managing to put out records that people want to listen to while the rest of the pop-punk scene is picking up makes me think that they're on the verge of a commercial hit like Monsters that we saw from All Time Low, and it's still really good to see from a band who's been busting their chops in the scene for a couple of years. Even Avril Lavigne is getting in on the action. Along with working with her partner Mod Sun on his recent record, she's also been making an album of her own, working with Mod Sun, Travis Barker, Machine Gun Kelly, and other collaborators on a record that should be dropping any day now. But with that collaborators list that's coming out of it and others who are sure to have been involved with the process, I think it's safe to say that Avril is leaning into the pop punk sound just as hard as she had before. The success of these pop-punk crossover acts has driven the sound's infiltration within the larger pop universe as well. The best example of this is probably Olivia Rodrigo, whose debut, Sour, channels 21st century alternative rock in a really clinical way. Songs like Brutal and Good For You are just straight up pop punk songs that really root themselves in that early 2000s nostalgia that's fueling this current wave of the pop punk boom.
I forgot to drop a plug about the Olivia Rodrigo video I did a few weeks back. It's good. She's alright. Watch it if you haven't.
Now, this whole landscape is pretty darn exciting to anyone like myself who missed pop punk's peak in the early 2000s. Fans like myself who had a couple of years to enjoy the emo scene and its popularity at its peak, but haven't really been able to experience the full decade of the 2000s just because I was too young. Now, experiencing it as a 20-something in 2021, someone with a little bit of buying power and a little bit of freedom, is a completely different experience than what it might have been like in the 2000s as a younger person trying to listen to this music. And I think it's a really welcome experience that I'm very excited to have. There's a whole generation of fans who have really felt the nostalgia for this sound without ever really experiencing the music at its peak. Some fans may have been in high school when pop punk was at its peak, but there are so many others who have heard of Blink-182 only through Spotify and through a handful of TikToks. They haven't really seen the likes of what this era was and are ready to experience it vicariously through nostalgia and through this new wave of bands who's defining the early 2020s for these younger folks experiencing the pop punk boom for the first time. I think aside from the baked-in nostalgia of pop punk, this revival is also the ultimate merger of a trend that has been in the works for years. Hip-hop is the most popular genre in the world, and a lot of the genre's success in the late 2010s has been a remnant of this emo rap influence that came up through the decade. Al Shipley at Spin reminded us that hip-hop inspired by pop punk is essential to the story of both genres, and that crossover has become the commercial fruit that has bared itself on both sides over the past couple of years. He wrote that whatever happens in 2021, it seems clear that the seeds planted by Lil Peep and Juice WRLD will continue to flourish long after they have passed. Seeing this merging influence result in straightforward pop punk is really exciting. But it's even cooler to see that this merger is both nostalgic and completely unique to the forces that it was born from. The unique blend of hip-hop and rock that drives this wave makes it distinct compared to the early 2000s sound that was really rooted in pop and punk, respectively. It gives it a whole new set of support and relevance that sits really firmly in the 2020s, in the same way that those pop punk and emo classics are a product of when they dropped back in the 2000s. Those of us who have tried our best to capture what a pop punk summer means growing up have finally had our prayers answered. Instead of relying on the same throwbacks that we have for years, pop punk is back in a way that is delivering our soundtrack to a summer that will be unlike any that we've seen in years. Now, if you want to catch up on the actual reasons why this scene is blowing up right now, check the description for a video from the Punk Rock MBA who really explains the reasons behind why this is all happening, but I hope you enjoyed me going off about how excited I am for this revival to be taking place. And if you actually want a playlist that captures what I think this pop punk summer is all about, look no further than, once again, the description, where I've made a collaborative pop punk summer playlist for us all to indulge in this summer. So make sure to add that to your Spotify and to add goodies that we can all enjoy so that we can have, the best summer ever.